Welcome to our Negotiating Your Commercial Lease webinar, hosted today by the New Haven Chamber of Commerce and the Black Business Alliance. My name is Anne Marie Knight. I'm the director of the Black Business Alliance. I'm pleased to be able to welcome you to this session today. I would really like to introduce to you today some folks who are joining us from the Yale Law School, and I'm going to give them an opportunity to introduce themselves. And then I'll come back for a few minutes before we dive into our presentation.
Thank you, Anne-Marie. Thanks so much. So I'm going to share my screen just now for us all. So my name is Jeff Gordon. I'm a student at Yale Law School, and I'm a member of our Small Business and Community Clinic. And we'll tell you a bit more about what our clinic does in a moment, but let's just introduce all of our members first.
Hi, everyone. My name is Hannah Abelo. I'm a third-year law student and another member of the clinic. Really glad to be here today with you all.
Hi, everyone. My name is Ben Delaroca, and I'm a second-year law student at Yale. Also excited to be here with you all today, and thanks so much for making the time to come.
So as you know, we're here to talk about commercial lease issues, especially as they relate to the challenging COVID-19 small business recovery climate that you're all dealing with right now. So who we are, so we said we're a clinic. You know what that means is we're a group of students supervised by a professor at Yale Law School, Anika Lamar, who's on the call with us right now. And this particular clinic got formed back in March to help small businesses survive and thrive as much as possible throughout all of the COVID-19 public health and economic challenges. And so we do trainings like this, and we give individual legal counseling to small businesses that need help. And we're very pleased and honored to co-host this presentation with the Greater New Haven Chamber of Commerce and the Black Business Alliance.
I think Anne-Marie had a couple more words she wanted to say about why we're here today, and then Jeff will be jumping right in to beginning the presentation.
Excellent. Thank you so much. I think it's important to anchor this conversation in the why this morning. Why are we here today? And we all know that businesses are struggling nationwide to pay their commercial and real estate leases, and that at this point in time, there may be many businesses and landlords who are at an impasse. And it's important for us to be able to open the lines of communication. And so this is an opportunity for us today to think about what can we do to communicate with each other, balance needs, and then figure out some really strategic ways that you can negotiate your lease. This is a critical time for small businesses, and we want to be able to provide this valuable support service to you. So go ahead, Jeff.
Thank you, Anne-Marie. Okay, so very briefly on why it matters. I mean, you all know why this is important. You're here for a reason. For many businesses, a lease is the biggest, most financially significant contract that you have, even during normal times. But especially during COVID-19, there's all kinds of new complications that come into play in terms of new costs and new regulations for keeping your property safe. And your lease ends up playing a really important role in dictating what you're responsible for, what your landlord is responsible for. And you know, some of those issues are somewhat more specific to retail businesses, we recognize, and we know not all of you are in the retail sector. And so we'll try to keep clear as we go what's more retail specific and what's not. But we think that for everyone who's here, we suspect that your lease is one of the most important contracts that you deal with. So what we're going to do in this conversation is maybe two major categories. So one thing, first we're going to talk about is what are some good ideas, what are some best practices for clauses, for provisions to put in your lease in normal times and during the pandemic. And then second, we're going to talk about, well, what happens once you already have your lease and things are starting to go wrong, either because business is slow and you're having trouble paying your rent, and you want to renegotiate your bargain with your landlord, or if things have gone even farther than that and your landlord is threatening to open eviction proceedings, what can you do at that point? So those are the two segments of this conversation. And really, I should say, you know, please really encourage you to chime in with questions in the chat or the Q&A along the way. And we're happy to stop and pause the presentation and just talk back and forth as much as you'd like. Before we get into the specific terms that we're going to suggest are we're going to suggest a bunch of possibly important terms that you might want to think about including in your next lease. But before we do that, just some basic background about leases in general. You may have arrived at your lease because your landlord gave it to you. You may have found a lease online that you downloaded. I've got this picture here of, you can go online and 1,000 websites will give you like a standard template commercial lease. And these are okay, but they're often not the best that we think you can do. They're often not necessarily in your best interest. And so part of the motivation for this conversation is to say, we know you might start off with this sort of form lease, but what's the next step? What's the next level of a better lease that really speaks to your interests and your needs? In the short term, we recognize that you may be stuck with the lease that you currently have, whether you like it or not. And so along the way, we're going to try to point out, what does your current lease, if your lease is silent, if your lease doesn't answer one of the things that we're trying to suggest, what is the likely default that you may be stuck with? What is the background, the baseline that will come into play, even if your lease doesn't address one of these issues? So I think Ben's going to take over now to talk about the categories of suggestions we have.
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. So with that said, let's dive into a bit more of the specific suggestions that we have as for what should actually be some of the terms that you would ideally have in your lease. So, as Jeff said, lease is an incredibly important document, and the language of the lease, the specific terms in your lease, is going to be the first place that you should look for determining what your rights are under the lease, what your obligations are under the lease. So it's important to have terms that speak to all of those important questions. Here we've broken down 5 different types of terms that we think are especially important for you to be considering as you're either thinking about signing a new lease, or as you're thinking about what terms in your existing lease are important and what terms should you be aware of. I'll just walk through them very quickly before we dive into the specifics. The first question that we think that you should have on your mind is you should pay attention to who is the party that is named on the lease. So in other words, did you sign the lease in your name or in the name of your business entity? Because that has implications for what things you personally are responsible for under the lease. The second category we want you to keep in mind is you want to have terms that speak to what are the expectations for each party, both you and your landlord, in terms of maintaining the physical condition of the property and things inside the property. Third, we want you to keep in mind what does your lease say about unexpected events, unexpected catastrophes, such as the COVID-19 pandemic? Are there protections that are built in? And we'll talk more about what some of those might look like in a few minutes. Fourth, we want you to keep in mind, what the consequences are of violating any of those terms that we just mentioned. So what happens to either you or your landlord if you don't hold up your end of the bargain? And then the final thing that you want to keep in mind is what should you do, or what can you do if you want to change some of the lease terms? Building in the possibility for change is an important component of a leases, particularly in uncertain times like these. So we'll start with the first category, which, as I said, is thinking about who the named parties are on your lease. So the main question you should think about, in short, is on your lease, is the party that has signed the lease and the party that the lease recognizes, is that the LLC, as in the company or business entity that you own, or is it you yourself as the owner in your personal capacity? So the reason why it is in the interest of many businesses to be signing a lease in the capacity of their business, not in their own name, is that essentially signing it in the name of your business can protect you as the business owner from some types of liability. It limits the extent to which your landlord can come after you directly, legally, in the event that you're unable to make payments. And it can also provide you the option to sell your business in some circumstances without breaking the lease. If you want to sell your business entirely, your business can stay in that property even though you have transferred ownership. An important thing to note, however, is that some landlords might require what is called a personal guarantee on your lease, and this is also something to be aware of. So you should keep in mind that even if you're signing a lease in the as an LLC or not in your own personal capacity, the owner might nevertheless include additional terms that essentially guarantee, for example, rent payments under the lease. So in other words, there might be a term that requires you in your personal capacity to still make rent payments and be responsible for making rent payments in the event that your business is unable to make those payments for any particular reason. And those guarantees might also limit your ability to transfer the lease or the business and require your landlord to approve any business transfers. So you should be very attentive to any personal guarantees that might be or provisions like that might be in your lease that could modify some of what we just said about signing in your own personal capacity versus as an LLC. Hannah, I think that Hannah is going to speak next about
yes,
physical property.
I'm going to speak next. And Ethan, we see your question in the chat. I'm going to go through this little section, and meanwhile, Jeff will take a look at your question, and we'll figure out where in the presentation we can best answer it, or whether it's something we should consult on separately. So next we're going to talk about sort of clarity around expectations for physical condition of the property. Jeff, if you could go to the next slide. This matters during normal times, like all of these things. It matters during normal times, matters even more right now when there's so much uncertainty. So typically, and your lease probably already has this, like some kind of maintenance and repairs provision, and a statement that premises shall be delivered to the tenant in good, clean condition. That's sort of the norm. That's the basic what a lease would have. In COVID-19, there are two sort of best practices that I would recommend keeping in mind if you're renegotiating your lease or amending your lease or just checking your lease to see what's in there, what's not. So one is, what happens if the space becomes unusable due to the pandemic? That's, again, during normal times, you're probably not anticipating your space becoming unusable, but now we don't know. If a public health authority orders closure for some reason, if if the building is somehow unusable in a pandemic related way, what can happen? So typically, even if there's something wrong with the building, even if there's some sort of something that's it's not in the condition you want it to be, you're still obligated to continue paying rent. That's sort of like the default rule. Mostly because it's these are what lawyers call like independent covenants. So your obligation to pay rent versus the obligation of the landlord to keep the building in certain condition are not necessarily things that are dependent on one another. But you may want to make sure that there are clauses in your lease that protect you in this situation. The second thing is, what happens if you need to make improvements, if you need to put in plexiglass, if you need different ventilation or hygiene procedures due to the pandemic? You may be responsible for this, but you may want to make sure that there's a clause in your lease that says that your landlord can't unreasonably withhold consent, they can't delay, and that you'll be able to make these changes to the physical premises as needed.
Great. So let's go to the third item that we flagged earlier, which is building in terms for your lease that speak to what happens in some sort of unexpected disaster or catastrophe. So there's a few terms that we want you to have in mind, or a few different types of protections you might have to build into your lease for if anything goes wrong, such as the global pandemic taking place. So let's talk about a couple of contract terms specifically that are good to have in your lease. So the first type of clause that we want you to be aware of, and I'll flag that this is only relevant for retail leases here. But the first type of clause is what's called a co-tenancy clause. So essentially what this type of clause is it is language that it relieves you of some of your obligations under the lease in the event that other tenants who also rent from the same landlord and that are located nearby have vacated their property. The idea behind this type of clause is, it's applicable especially to businesses that might be open in some sort of like larger shopping center or in some location where there's a lot of other stores or other retail institutions that basically draw lots of customers to the general location where the business property is located. And the presence of all those businesses basically attracts customers that can benefit all the businesses in the area. So what a number of lease contracts for businesses who are in such locations is, what a lot of them will say is that if, for instance, 50% of the tenants in the landlord's properties have been vacated or are not operating businesses, then the rent or other payments you need to make might be reduced by a particular amount of money. And it's important to note that, the exact types of relief that you might be able to benefit from under this type of clause, and the exact situations in which you might be able to turn to this clause, are usually specified very clearly in the language of the clause itself, i.e. it will say, this will take effect if 50%, for instance, of the businesses are not operating, and it will relieve you of, for instance, half of your rent payments. The second type of clause that we want you to be aware of is what's called a force majeure clause. And essentially what this type of clause is a clause that specifically says, in the event of some sort of really unforeseen disaster, or some situation that makes it really hard for the business to operate, the business might also have some of its obligations under the lease relieved as well. The important thing to note about this type of clause, though, is that it usually it's not going to apply to a situation like a pandemic unless the clause itself directly says that its terms cover a pandemic. So unless the word pandemic or something like that is in the lease itself, usually it won't be able to be triggered. And we've seen clients in the past who saw this clause in their contract and identified it and wondered about whether it might, the pandemic seems to qualify as some sort of disaster or an act of God, is sometimes the language used. And people have commonly thought that the pandemic might be covered under this type of lease. But upon closer inspection, it's just not the case that the lease term, that the force majeure clause extends to situations beyond what's really specified in the literal language of the contract. There are a couple of other types of protections for catastrophes or disasters that we do want you to be aware of, though we would emphasize again that these are applicable primarily to retail leases, and they're likely less reliable sources of protection than the contract terms that I just described a second ago. That being said, it's worthwhile if you have business interruption insurance to look at the terms of that insurance, because it's possible that your insurance terms also include pandemics, in which case you might be liable for some, or you might be able to benefit from some insurance payments. It's important to note that, again, like the force majeure clause, it's unlikely that business interruption insurance will qualify for events related to COVID-19 unless your contract specifically includes pandemics or similar language. And in the state of Connecticut, it's also unlikely that the fact that the state of Connecticut has declared a state of emergency, that's also something that probably wouldn't really have an impact on your business interruption insurance. The government of Connecticut has issued guidance to businesses saying that the state of emergency declaration doesn't usually implicate insurance terms. So it's primarily if the insurance mentions pandemics or something of that nature specifically that this would come into play. The final thing that we want you to be aware of is, later on down the road, if you do have some sort of dispute with your landlord and you do find yourself, seeking protection in court or invoking that type of protection, there are some types of legal arguments that businesses can make in court in situations where they're not able to perform under their lease due to some sort of catastrophe. These types of arguments, the names for them are just the impracticability arguments and frustration of purpose arguments. Essentially what these types of arguments that court recognize are essentially they're arguments that performance under the contract is truly impossible due to some type of crisis or event that's really unforeseen. I just want to emphasize, though, that the standard for when this applies is very, very high. The event has to be truly unforeseen. The event has to truly directly cause your ability to not perform under the contract. And usually courts in Connecticut are going to only be sympathetic to this argument when the damages you face are really, really excessive. So this might be the type of thing that you can think about in extreme circumstances. But typically for most businesses, this is not a reliable way to relieve yourself of some of your lease obligations. So we encourage you again to be aware of these types of relief, but to pay most attention to the two contract terms that I've highlighted above for your business leases. And I think Hannah is up next, or perhaps Jeff is, in describing the consequences of lease violation for either party.
It's me. All right, so next we'll talk about, as Ben said, the consequences. So what happens if either party violates the lease? So, everyone's under a lot of stress during this pandemic, financial and otherwise. Your landlord may violate the lease. If your landlord violates the lease, you may be able to use that as an opportunity to negotiate for a reduction in rent. Or you may be able to, under the terms of the lease, actually terminate the lease. But you might not want to do that because you might want to stay in the space. And that's when sort of negotiating for a reduction may actually make the most sense. Your landlord probably also has rights under the terms of your lease. Some common things are that a landlord might be able to draw down on your security deposit. They might be able to sue you or seek damages, so back rent, late charges, other types of fees. And almost definitely your landlord will be able to, if you have severely enough violated your lease in a way that the lease allows for eviction, may be able to initiate eviction proceedings, which we'll talk about a little bit later on here. So your landlord does have to mitigate damages. So like if you leave your lease, if you say, I have to shut down and I'm closing out early, your landlord does have to make at least a reasonable effort to find a tenant to continue the lease term, but that may be really difficult right now during the current economic downturn. And the default rule, like the basic rule in the courts here in Connecticut, is not that your landlord needs to go above and beyond to find a new tenant for the space. They may just be able to make you pay for it once they make reasonable efforts. So if you're in if you have an opportunity to renegotiate your lease, or you're in a moment where you're doing so, you may want to put in a clause that specifically requires the landlord to sort of take specific steps to really mitigate those damages or really look for a new tenant in the event that you have to vacate the space early. That way you're not on the hook for as many months of rent as you might be otherwise. There are also questions around legal fees. If you do end up in court, there are certain ways that you can write into your lease that someone has to actually win a lawsuit. They have to be the prevailing party in order to get legal fees paid for. That way, your landlord won't be incentivized to bring silly lawsuits and harassing lawsuits just to make you do something differently, and then have you be on the hook for legal fees.
So the last category of suggestions for leases concerns what changes can you make? Like what happens when the term of your lease ends, or if you want to leave early? And so I guess the context for this part is that we've noticed and we've heard that during the pandemic climate, many people are seeking to renegotiate relatively shorter term leases. And we understand why that would make sense when you've got a lot of uncertainty on the horizon. But our suggestion here is that even if a short-term lease makes sense for you, you probably want to give yourself as much flexibility as possible to extend that, or on the flip side, to sublet to someone else if it turns out that your business really isn't viable at some point in time. And so this set of clauses that we're suggesting are all ways to make changes along the way. So one category of changes that may be useful to work into your lease on the front end if you're renegotiating is clauses that allow you to assign or sublet. Assign basically means that you're transferring your lease entirely to someone else who becomes the new tenant. And sublet, as you probably know, means that you're still the tenant, but someone who's subletting from you now has to pay you, and you in turn will pay the landlord. The kind of clause that is most useful here is one that says, if I find someone who wants to take over my lease, and they're able to pay and they want to pay, the landlord can't just unreasonably say, no, we don't want to let you replace yourself with this new person. The landlord cannot unreasonably withhold consent. This is usually a common sense term that landlords should be relatively amenable to because the other person is presumably willing to pay just as you are. The second category is how does your lease treat renewal? And so we think it's usually a good idea for a tenant to build in an opportunity to renew and to specify how much of a rent increase, if any, is allowed upon renewal. So in this clause, it might say something like, upon renewal, rent may not be increased by more than 2 or 5%. Another key aspect of these clauses would be, when do you have to give notice to your landlord if you intend to renew, and how do you know that you've renewed? Having clarity about exactly what it means to say, yep, I'm committing to renew, can help prevent conflict and possible legal problems down the road. And finally, another option to give yourself is, well, what happens if your business is going well and you want to stay in your property, but the landlord has decided to try to sell this property to someone else who might use it for a different purpose and might not want you as a tenant anymore? And so if you think that's any possibility, some people build in what's called a right of first refusal clause, which says if the landlord wants to sell the property, you as the tenant get the first offer to match the amount of money that someone else is willing to pay, and to therefore buy it yourself. So these are all ways to kind of plan towards the long term, both on the upside in the event that you want to stay in the property, as well as on the downside if you need to get out a little bit early. I'm going to turn to Hannah for this.
If you breach your lease, so if you violate your lease, lawyers call it breaching, or you cannot pay your rent, then your landlord may be able to evict you. So the most common way, or may have grounds to begin eviction proceedings. Let's put it that way. The most common grounds for beginning eviction proceedings are non-payment of rent. So this just means you got sufficiently behind on your rent that under the terms of your lease, they're able to start those proceedings. There are other reasons also. So your lease might have expired, that you're sort of just still in a space that you're no longer able to be in. You may have breached, so you did something that you weren't allowed to do under the terms of the lease, even though you were paying. Or there's some sort of illegal conduct that is being alleged. So those are some things that you might see if your landlord does begin eviction proceedings against you. Unfortunately, and there's been a lot of back and forth around how long the eviction moratorium will be extended, will it be renewed, will it be, et cetera. None of that matters for commercial tenants, because in Connecticut, the eviction moratorium for the COVID-19 pandemic does not protect commercial tenants. That can be confusing for people because in some states it does protect commercial tenants, but it does not here in Connecticut. That doesn't mean that you won't be able to negotiate with your landlord. You may be able to, for all of the reasons we've been talking about throughout. You have a lot of leverage in the current economic moment. So, like I said, you have a lot of leverage here on negotiating with your landlord. This is a moment where landlords typically are not trying to have tenants leave because they know it may be a challenge to find a new tenant. So there are some options for things that you might want to consider negotiating for. So you may want to get a full or partial rent abatement. I've worked with a client who was only able to, it was a food service provider, they were only able to be open a couple of days a week rather than every day as they had been pre-pandemic because of this flow of business slowing down. And they were able to talk to their landlord about it, make clear that they were only making a certain portion of their rent and get a sort of comparable portion of their normal revenues, like however much less they were making, they were able to negotiate to pay that much less in rent for the duration of the pandemic. And so, landlords are willing, not all, but we have seen many landlords be willing to negotiate with tenants along terms like that. Some landlords may say, no way, I don't want to fully give up the chance of getting that full rent, but they may be willing to defer it. They may be realistic and say, okay, I know you can't pay now, you're still going to owe me that rent, but you can pay it to me in 6 months, in a year, in whatever time frame. Some landlords, what they want is stability. What they want to know is that they will continue to have a tenant in the space for a longer period of time. They don't want vacancies. They may be willing to lower your rent if you're willing to extend your lease term and stay in the space longer. Now, I know that's contrary to what we said earlier around a lot of people want shorter leases right now, but this is all situation specific. If you know you want to be in a space for the long term, you've been there a long time, it's where your clients know to come, etc., but you can't make the high rent that you've been paying before, blending and extending might make sense for you. Lastly, you may be able to negotiate an early termination. If you do have to end a lease and you do have to leave that lease, leave that space, you want to do it on as good a terms as possible so that you don't end up in court, you don't end up paying more than needed. So rather than unilaterally terminating, working together to negotiate that early termination is another potential path.
Related to this discussion of negotiating, I wanted to put a topic on the table that I know is often scary at first, but we think doesn't need to be as scary as it sometimes sounds. And that is the possibility of your business filing for bankruptcy. And so just one thing to mention is that as scary as the concept of bankruptcy sometimes sounds, wanted to point out that a lot of the most successful big businesses in the country do this all the time and often emerge all the better for it several years later. So I've got at the bottom just a few examples of pretty big recognizable companies from GM to Marvel to Delta that have all gone through the bankruptcy process over the past decade or so and have emerged quite well on the other side. So we think there's really no shame, especially in the context that, early in the pandemic in March and April, many large businesses were strategically filing for bankruptcy for precisely this reason as it relates to overdue and unpaid rent payments. So the key thing to know about the intersection between bankruptcy and your rent is that there's often a good chance that in bankruptcy, the rent payments that you owed before you entered bankruptcy are quite likely to be reduced in the bankruptcy process. Although on the other hand, the rent payments that come due after you enter bankruptcy, those are more likely to be paid in full. So that's one distinction to keep in mind. Another useful aspect of bankruptcy is, we mentioned a few slides ago that when you violate your lease, one action that your landlord likely has against you is to apply your security deposit against those overdue rent payments. Well, if you're in bankruptcy, the security deposit ends up getting a higher degree of protection and can't be used right away to be counted back against your rent payments. So that's an extra degree of protection that may be useful depending on how worried you are about that security deposit. And I think the real bottom line here to emphasize is that all of this can influence your negotiating posture, whether or not you ultimately do file for bankruptcy or not. Because if your landlord understands the set of dynamics, they may understand that you entering bankruptcy is not a great deal for them either. And that may make them willing to settle for some of the negotiating moves that Hannah described on the previous slide. So it's a useful possibility to keep in the background that may improve your negotiating position. And of course, we'll be happy to talk further with anyone who has more specific questions about whether bankruptcy is a realistic scenario for your particular business. Finally, a thing just to mention briefly, and this really is a topic that ends up requiring more targeted one-on-one legal advice if you find yourself in this position, is just to be aware of what's the procedure if your landlord decides to initiate an eviction proceeding, most likely, as Hannah mentioned, because you haven't been able to pay rent. So the way that you'll know this is happening is when you receive a notice, probably on the front door of your business, called a notice to quit possession. This is an eviction notice. And this is really the time to start seeking legal help by reaching out to us or reaching out to other lawyers that you may know. After that, what's likely going to happen is that your landlord will file in court a complaint alleging that, here's what you didn't do. You didn't pay rent. There were other violations. You may disagree. You may think that they're mischaracterizing what happened. And so there's an opportunity for you and your lawyers to draft an answer to try to correct the record. And that's a key aspect that you probably want legal representation for, to draft an answer to the landlord's complaint. There may be a motion for you to pay rent payments that have been overdue. And again, you'll need to explain to the court why you are or are not able to make those rent payments. And again, we think it's never too late, even if your landlord has initiated eviction proceedings. It's never too late to keep trying to negotiate. Trials are costly and inconvenient for everyone, and we think it's never too late to try to use some of those same negotiating steps that Hannah mentioned a few moments ago to avoid a trial for everyone's benefit. And of course, there is always a possibility that it does end up going to trial.
So just to wrap up the presentation here, as we've emphasized throughout, we really think that each of the provisions that we talked about in the first half of the presentation, those are all important things for you to be putting into your next lease and thinking about how to incorporate them, as well as if you're thinking about what rights and obligations you have under your current lease, those are all things you should be looking for as well. And one of the most important takeaways, like Jeff and Hannah were just saying, is, if you find yourself in a situation where you're not able to make your rent payments, trying to make some sort of deal with your landlord prior to getting to that eviction process that Jeff just spoke about, that's usually going to be the best way forward for everyone involved. So we really encourage you to continue communicating with your landlord and using some of the tactics that Jeff and Hannah spoke about in order to try to find some sort of agreement there, which will be beneficial to both parties. I'd also like to emphasize that, the three of us, we've dealt with these topics with a number of business clients, and we'd be more than happy to do a free 30-minute consultation with folks who have attended this presentation. We'd be happy to hear about concerns that you have, and we'd be happy to do that consultation and perhaps let you know if there's other services that we might be able to help you out with. In the meantime, we've left the contact information for our clinic at the Yale Law School on this slide, as well as a phone number that you can call. And we, again, really encourage you to reach out to us at any time. And thank you so much for making time to be here today.
Okay,
Thank you.
Yep. Go ahead, Gary.
And as Anne-Marie just put into the chat, if people have questions, you can put them into the chat or the Q&A. One thing I'll just pick up on that you guys said was communicate. I think that's so key, and it's not just the trying to make a negotiation, but I think so oftentimes, this is obviously troubling if you can't make your rent. That's not a situation we all want to deal with, but if you stop communicating with your landlord at that point, and then you don't contact them for another 2 months, that's going to make the situation a lot more contentious. So, if you're having problems, start talking to your landlord right away and stay in communication. Don't avoid the issue. It only gets worse the longer you go on with it. Let's see if we've got some questions in the chat. So far, everyone's saying it's very helpful, so that's good. Again, if you have specific questions, and what I really like that you guys offered is those consultations. So, if anyone's in a situation that's difficult, please take the Yale Law School Clinic up on that offer. That's a great offer. And even if that's not today, you can follow up with us through the chamber or directly contact the Law School Clinic or through the Black Business Alliance, and we will connect you with them. And Marie, anything you want to add? Oh, go ahead, Hannah.
Yeah. Just Ethan, I see your sort of 3 questions or 2.5 questions in the chat. And I know we've worked with you in the past, we worked together in the spring. Why don't we, since these are sort of like specific legal issues that relate to your ongoing negotiations with your landlord, why don't we plan to connect offline and we can talk through some of these issues with you if that works for you. Okay, great.
Okay, thanks. Do you mind if part of the question if I read part of the question and then we can just have a chat about it, because I think it goes more to Garrett's point about how we continue these negotiations and how we communicate with each other, landlords and tenants. And in Ethan's question, he was indicating that he had already negotiated 50% of his lease, and then it went back up to the full rate. And as things are starting to move backwards again, he's considering going back to that 50%. So he wants to know how to approach it with the landlord. And I think that's a key part of what this conversation is about. So I wanted to just add in to highlight Garrett's point, to your point, Garrett, that communication is key. And I think it's also important to remember that this is not an us against them negotiation, right? It's important to remember that landlords have responsibilities, financial responsibilities, and also challenges at this time in the same way that your business does. And so when we enter into the conversation, I think it's important for us to think from their point of view as well, right? As we go into the conversation. Think long-term. I love what you said about abatement and deferment and blend and extend and those kinds of conversations. But when we come to the conversation, think, how can we negotiate this long-term? And also consider what you bring to the table. I think it's important to be able to show if you've been a tenant for a long period of time, if your business has a good credit rating, you've been there for a long period of time. It's also important to be able to kind of sing your praises and show the positive sides of your business as you're presenting kind of your negotiation plan or what you'd like to see, what your plan is with your landlord. What do you think on that?
George has a question here. George, I'll allow you to, let's see. Even if you're in good standing rent-wise, should I still try to negotiate a reduction during the pandemic? You know, I think that I'll leave that to law school clinic. I'll just say at the start, you know, I think everyone's looking at all of their costs right now, and you're trying to think of, you know, the long term with so many unknowns. So if you can do that, then, you know, great for you. But, you know, worth kind of looking into, I guess. You guys have anything you want to add on that?
You mentioned, George, the relevance of the co-tenancy provisions. And I think the answer may depend on whether there is a co-tenancy clause in your original lease, or you may be interested in trying to negotiate one of those from scratch. I'm not sure. So we'd be happy to talk with you more about how your situation relates to the co-tenancy issue.
I think Jeff and George had the same idea, because at the same time as you said that, George said in the chat, okay, thanks, I'll call clinic.
You know, and I know just even in the last few days, a lot of uncertainty because we've seen the cases rise and immediately people are starting to question, you know, are we going to go back to a lockdown? I mean, my hope is not that, you know, I think, and it does look like there'll be more cases rising, but I also think that, you know, we're in a different spot than where we were in the spring, and that we know a lot more, understand a lot more about the transmission. So, you know, definitely important to kind of think ahead and think of how we can continue, how you can be prepared as a business to deal with that. You know, but hopefully we'll be able to still do business going forward. So I think as you're preparing or trying to understand your finances on this, my expectation is it is going to be a little bit different situation than the spring, even if we do continue on this route of a spike. All right. Any other questions out there? Okay. Yep. Question about moving back in phases. You know, I do think that obviously there's going to be, you know, to the extent of talking about phases and that it's, the rise in cases yesterday was really significant and probably most concerning. And I know definitely at the state level they're considering rollbacks and phases. The one thing I try to tell people at Empower and who can make these choices is that, you know, what we've seen in business activity, that's not really the driver of where we've seen cases. You know, especially if you look back at the summer. Everything reopened, we stayed flat or even had cases decline. It really comes down to our individual actions and responsibility. And obviously, if you get to a point where the spread is so much, then you need to limit people's mobility in general, but trying to get across that point of that the business activity itself, sometimes it's even safer than other places, because most stores require you to walk in with a mask, and everyone's wearing a mask in there. So, but it's definitely a fine balance, and we're all trying to follow the science and do the things that keep the communities healthy and safe as possible. Any other lease issues, questions? Anything else that you guys want to bring up?
No, just thank you again. Thank you, Anne Marie and Garrett and everyone for joining. And we're looking forward to following up with a couple of you at least afterwards.
I would just add, we're gonna make a version of this presentation available standing online. Thanks to Garrett and Anne Marie. And so if you have friends and colleagues who you think might benefit from this information, please, send it along to them and encourage them to watch the recording of this.
Excellent.
Anne-Marie?
Thank you all so much. Thank you. We did actually broadcast this live on Facebook on the Chamber website, so you can find it there. We'll post it on the BBA website. But thank you all so much. It was wonderful information and very helpful, I can see from the participants. And thank you all for attending today. Garrett.
Great. Thank you, everyone. Great session. Appreciate it. We'll let everyone know that we have our Big Connect coming up on November 16th through 19th. So look out for all of our advertising about that. And always great to partner with the Black Business Alliance and also with the Yale Law School Clinic. So thank you, everyone. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you.